Okay. All right. Hey, what's up, animal allies? What's up? I'll wait a minute as folks join us. In the meantime, please check in and say hi where you are in the world. And if you're with a group, feel free to share that. And the question of the day is, did you see Wicked? And what did you think? It was very pro animal. Would you agree? So feel free to put your comments about that, related and unrelated, sort of. But anyway, in animal rights news, another unexpectedly quick victory for fur bearing animals. Rick Owens is officially going fur free following a short but powerful campaign launched by the Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade, again, CAFT, on December 10th, 2025. Rick Owens, an influential trend-setting luxury brand that was selling handbags made from mink and beaver fur as recently as this week, confirmed in an email to CAFT that it will no longer use fur. The brand's fur-free commitment can now be found on the Eco-Aware section of the Rick Owens website. The victory for wildlife comes on the heels of fur-free commitments from Hearst magazines and New York Fashion Week after anti-fur campaigns launched by CAFT. So props to CAFT and everyone who was involved in that campaign. A bit about AAC. AAC was created to equip activists with the tools, community, and resources they need to boldly participate in our global animal liberation movement. AAC offers a free 3-month mentorship program, free educational live streams, and online training, a podcast called the Animal Liberation Hour, and we host large-scale, in-person, collaborative events around the country. In fact, AAC is heading to Los Angeles, California, with CAFT and ICAW, January 23rd through February 1st, 2026. Housing is limited. Register now for 10 action-packed days of impactful animal rights activism. We'll put the link tree in the comments. AAC is a support system for you as an activist and a resource designed to empower grassroots activism. So tonight, we're with you, welcoming back Chris Carraway from AALDP, Zoe Rosenberg's lead counsel. AAC stands in solidarity with Zoe. She is communicating through DXC, and recently they posted, I'm just going to read you a little bit of what she posted, I think just yesterday or today. It's a few days into my jail sentence. The people in the cells around me are screaming and banging on their doors. They're often crying. They want to be free. I spend nearly 23 hours a day in a small cell in isolation. Then I get to briefly enter a common area by myself. It's hard not to think of life on the outside. I think about flowers I pass on my morning walks in Berkeley and the whistles of songbirds. I think of the animals at my sanctuary exploring the sun, but also of animals who aren't so lucky, who are suffering far worse than I am here. Billions of animals are locked up in factory farms across the US. So many individuals are forced to suffer in confinement. Animals who never should have been born into these places to begin with. It may seem like an insurmountable problem, but the thing is, these systems only exist because we let them. We give power with our complacency. The institutions that hold power know this. That's why I'm here. When I rescued Poppy, Ivy, Aster, and Azalea, I did more than save their individual lives. I challenged their status as things, as property that can be used and abused at a corporation's whim. That is why I was arrested, charged, and harshly prosecuted. They feared others would see what I see and act as I acted and bring the whole animal exploitation system toppling down. I know without a doubt that as long as animals are forced to live in distress and suffering, people will find the courage to take away their complacency, to reclaim their power, and bring liberation to life through protest, advocacy, and direct acts of rescue. All right, so we're going to learn more about this onto our program. We will be taking questions after the presentation, but Chris, welcome back. So nice to have you.
Good evening. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all those joining on YouTube.
Yeah, so I know you want to go ahead and share your screen and your
Yeah. So I just want to kind of talk to y'all a little bit about sort of what happened in Zoe's case and just a few preliminary comments I have about that. First things first, though, is my name is Chris Carraway. I am the staff attorney at the Animal Activist Legal Defense Project. In short, we defend animal rights activists in criminal cases all over the country. We also operate as a law school clinic where we are training young law students in how to act as a movement attorney and defend activists. And I'm proud to say that I am Zoe Rosenberg's attorney. But a little bit about Zoe's case and who Zoe is for those that are unfamiliar with her. Zoe is a 23-year-old animal rights activist from the Bay Area, working with the group Direct Action Everywhere. She is also the founder of Happy Hen Animal Sanctuary, an animal sanctuary in California that she co-founded with her mother when she was about 12 years old. Zoe is the epitome of a lifelong animal rights activist, as she's held these compassionate, empathetic beliefs towards animals since she was a young child, telling people in her elementary school not to step on the bugs on the sidewalk and putting up posters of dogs that need to be adopted. And particularly, Zoe had an early affinity towards chickens. She had chickens growing up and viewed them as members of her family, and particularly felt their pain and suffering through the factory farm system. And it's those sort of early ideals that Zoe has continued to live, which ultimately brought her inside a Petaluma poultry slaughterhouse in June of 2023. Now, often this case is referred to as the Purdue Rescue. And that's because Purdue Farms, one of the largest poultry producers in the country, a billion-dollar company, owns the Petaluma Poultry Slaughterhouse, which is the facility that Zoe helped investigate and ultimately rescued animals from, chickens from Poppy, Ivy, Aster, and Azalea on her 21st birthday in June of 2023. I'm going to play you the video of that exact rescue. And that is Zoe right up there on the transport cages, which have hundreds and thousands of birds jammed into these crates. Records from the Petaluma Poultry Slaughterhouse showed that upwards of 100+ birds die on these trucks, nearly every truckload, as they are transported from the factory farm to the slaughterhouse. And some of these trips can be as little as 20 minutes, and you're still finding hundreds plus of birds that are dying in that short period of time. And what Zoe is doing here is she's looking through these crates to try to find the birds that are in the most immediate need of care, because this is what's called an open rescue, which in some is going to rescue animals that are in need of urgent care. Activists do this openly because they believe what they are doing is not just morally justified, but lawfully justified, and they have nothing to hide, which is precisely why Zoe put this on the internet, never denied what she did, and ultimately testified, this is exactly what I did. And it's important to recognize the context in which this specific case happened in, because Direct Action Everywhere has been investigating animal facilities, factory farms, slaughterhouses for a few years, specifically in Sonoma County, where the animal agriculture industry is one of the major players. It all kind of started in 2018 when activists did an open rescue and investigation at McCoy's Poultry, which is a factory farm that is owned by Purdue. Ultimately, McCoy's was recommended for animal cruelty charges to the district attorney by Sonoma County Animal Control, and the district attorney declined to do anything. There were other investigations, Sunrise Factory Farms, Right Guard Duck Farm, and that ultimately culminated in a series of open rescues at all three facilities, McCoy's, Sunrise, and Right Guard. Ultimately, activists were arrested and charged, and one activist, Wayne Chung, the co-founder of DXC, went to trial in 2023. Unfortunately, Wayne was convicted of 3 of the 4 charges there, and that case is currently on appeal, in which our project is doing the appeal, and we're pending oral argument. Moving on, however, at sort of the same time, activists are really focusing on Purdue facilities, and that includes investigations of Purdue-related factory farms, not just McCoy's, but a facility called Hunter Lane, and that's what this photo is of. It's Zoe inside Hunter Lane, where in April 2023 she entered, found disturbing paperwork that indicated that the mortality rate in this specific factory farm was significantly, nearly twice the amount of the industry standard. She found birds that were unable to get off their back or were otherwise immobile to access food and water. She found countless dead birds amongst the live birds, and she ultimately came across Vincent and Petunia, 2 birds that were in immediate need of rescue. And she removed them. She brought them to a vet who told her, don't hold your breath that these birds will survive. And miraculously, after being hospitalized, those birds did survive. And consistent with open rescue, Zoe was completely open about this, reported this to law enforcement. Additionally, the Petaluma Poultry Slaughterhouse has been well known of being a significant problem with salmonella rates. Based on USDA records. Within the last 3 years, for 2 of those years, this slaughterhouse specifically has been in the worst category of the USDA for systemic issues related to salmonella, which not only causes a significant risk to the birds, but also a significant public health risk. So all this sort of leads up to an investigation into the slaughterhouse beginning in April 2023 that was started by another individual. And throughout that investigation, in which activists entered a couple of times, hidden cameras were placed, which showed birds not being appropriately stunned, meaning they go through the slaughter process, flailing, getting cut improperly as they go through the automated throat slitter, generally getting hurt and suffering cruelty. Activists found documents that show just how many birds are being condemned based on disease, dying on arrival in those transport trucks, and even birds that have been condemned as cadavers, which is generally by the industry and government regulators synonymous with being scalded alive. Zoe and other activists reported all this to law enforcement numerous times, and consistent with how Sonoma County has handled these complaints, they did nothing. So on June 13th, Zoe's 21st birthday, she and other activists entered the facility and rescued some birds from a slaughterhouse transport truck. Zoe rescued Poppy, Ivy, Aster, and Azalea. Another group rescued a handful of other birds. And there was a third group that came upon another transport truck and rescued other birds for a total of 18 birds. And these birds had a variety of issues ranging from injuries, cuts, abrasions, and bruises, various parasites such as coccidia, things that are indicative of suffering and can lead to worse things, parasites or antibodies for infectious bursal disease, infectious bronchitis virus. One of the birds had to be hospitalized, and a variety of other just maladies suggestive that Petaluma Poultry was neglecting their birds and committing animal cruelty. So because Zoe was open about this, it was no question that she went in and did the conduct. When Wayne was sentenced in the fall of 2023, Zoe was once again walking across the parking lot from the courthouse to once again report animal cruelty at the slaughterhouse where she was arrested, thus beginning this case. Now, the charges that Zoe had They vary throughout the proceedings. Ultimately, at trial, there were 4 counts. The first was felony conspiracy to commit a misdemeanor trespass. Conspiracy essentially is entering into an agreement intending to do something unlawful. Now, in California, it's unusual because you can be charged with felony conspiracy for agreeing to do something that is misdemeanor conduct. In most other states, I think nearly every other state, that is not the rule. Generally, conspiracies are treated as the same type of crime as what you're agreeing to do, if not 1 degree less serious. And the district attorney has discretion. They could have charged this as a misdemeanor, but consistent with their purpose of overcharging this case to scare activists, they aggressively pursued a felony. She was also charged with 2 counts of misdemeanor trespass, which are effectively different ways to commit a trespass, and motor vehicle tampering, which effectively is removing something from a vehicle. In this case, removing poppy, ivy, aster, and azalea from the transport truck. Now, during the case, she was also charged with burglary, which was a charge that we got dismissed when we challenged it during an earlier proceeding. The state essentially gave up and voluntarily moved to dismiss that charge. And she was charged with misdemeanor theft. The state dismissed that a few weeks before our original trial setting. And we believe, consistent with prior cases, that they did that because theft cases generally involve a discussion of market value, which opens the door for us to discuss more in depth the conditions of the birds. And you'll see that it was kind of the state's purpose to limit us talking about just how poorly Petaluma Poultry treats their birds. Ultimately, our ideal main defense was essentially arguing that the doctrine of necessity applies, and that's why Zoe is not guilty or justified in her conduct. To simplify it, necessity essentially allows one to commit what is otherwise a criminal act if it's to prevent a worse imminent harm. So we wanted to argue that preventing chickens from suffering animal cruelty is less harmful than, or preventing that is more important than the harm from a minor trespass. Now, the court denied us the necessity defense, finding that ultimately the doctrine of necessity cannot be applied to rescuing animals or alleviating harm to animals, which is consistent to how the court ruled. A different judge in Sonoma County ruled in Wayne Shung's trial 2 years prior. That is an issue that we are appealing in Wayne's case and will appeal in Zoe's case. Now, the second defense that we ultimately was our primary defense at trial is arguing that she simply did not have the intent to commit a crime. It was her sole intent to provide aid to animals that were suffering from criminal animal cruelty. Now, the trial lasted 7 weeks, which is incredibly unusual for a criminal trial. You'll see homicide cases take a week. So to see a felony conspiracy to commit misdemeanor conduct and trespass charges in which the defendant admits to doing the acts take 7 weeks is truly extraordinary. And day in, day out, we were fighting the state about what evidence we could introduce to fully discuss why Zoe did what she did, what she was relying on, and ultimately her intent. And as a result, there was simply a lot of excluded evidence that we would have liked to introduce to explain to the jury fully what Zoe's intent was. Some of that excluded evidence were conditions of all the birds that were rescued. The judge only allowed us to talk about the 4 birds that Zoe specifically rescued and not the other 14, which of course provides a full picture of the scope of the variety of criminal animal cruelty that was happening at the slaughterhouse. The fact that a lot of the other birds had similar issues were in other situations or conditions of physical ailments. One of the birds had to be hospitalized. The jury was never allowed to know that. We were precluded from introducing not just photos, but specific information of condemnation records and other records from the slaughterhouse that showed how many birds are condemned based on a variety of diseases, including blood diseases, how many birds are arriving dead on the trucks, as well as how many birds are being condemned as cadavers, which I mentioned is generally treated as synonymous with birds that are being scalded alive, meaning that they're going through the entire slaughter process. They're not getting stunned. They're not getting automatically slaughtered by the automatic throat slitter. They are being missed by the single person whose job it is to look at and ensure that all the birds are being slaughtered if they're not killed by the automatic throat slitter. And those birds go through generally at a rate of 90 birds a minute. So obviously it's pretty improbable that every bird that is not stunned correctly or slaughtered correctly is going to get identified by the manual throat slaughter. We weren't allowed to introduce paperwork that showed that on one occasion, 76 birds were condemned as cadavers. We weren't allowed to introduce evidence from the USDA that showed a lot of this similar evidence. We weren't allowed to talk about systemic cruelty at other Purdue-related facilities, such as going in depth about Hunter Lane, the factory farm that Zoe investigated just days before the alleged conspiracy began in April of 2023. And these are birds that end up at the slaughterhouse. So logically, if a bird is suffering from cruelty or just generally suffering 45 minutes away from the slaughterhouse, then it's a reasonable inference that when they're there at the slaughterhouse on those trucks, they are still going to be suffering and had been suffering for some time. We're also excluded from talking about the scope of all the prior reports that other individuals have made to law enforcement. And throughout the criminal case, the state had provided, as they're required to do, all those reports, and that was over 600 different files. The jury was never allowed to hear any of this. Unfortunately, the outcome is that Zoe was found guilty on all counts. And on December 3rd, she was sentenced to 30 days in jail. And in California, she had 1 day of credit for time served, and you get basically day for day credit. So really, she's going to spend 14 days in jail. And after that, she has to serve 60 days in a jail alternative program, such as work release or in-home detention. And that roughly translates to about 30 days. She also has 2 years of probation. And I think it's important to note that Zoe gave a pretty remarkable, defiant sentencing statement to the court in which she rightly refused to apologize for her conduct. The only apologies that she gave were to all the other birds that she couldn't rescue. And she urged other activists not to be afraid based on what happened to her and to keep fighting for the animals. Zoe's case will be appealed. We'll be raising similar issues as to Wayne's case, whether necessity can apply to preventing harms to animals, for example. The appeals process takes some time, though, so we would not anticipate any sort of relief there for at least 2 years. Now, just a couple of observations I had throughout the trial, and I think one that I thought was interesting but unsurprising was the district attorney's attitude and aggressively prosecuting this case. It was clear that they had a strong bias. They really had it out for direct action everywhere. They also had a strong bias in favor of the agriculture industry, which is, as I mentioned, one of the largest industries. Bluntly, they were a shill for Purdue Farms, and that's how they acted throughout this trial. And it was interesting how obsessed the district attorney, particularly the main prosecutor, Matt Hobson, was with direct action everywhere, with their politics, with their views, with their theories of change. There was an obsession with DXE's prior activism, whether that was other open rescues or acts of civil disobedience or participating in ballot initiatives. There was an obsession with direct action everywhere's 40-year plan to have a kinder world for animals involving legislative changes and things like that. And, you know, I think it really hits the nail on the head when you look at the district attorney's sentencing statements. It wasn't about what generally a prosecutor talks about in terms of sentencing, deterrence, someone's background, things like that. The main focus was doing PR for Purdue. They were effectively arguing they didn't prove animal cruelty, while completely ignoring the fact that the district attorney himself argued in many instances successfully to exclude a lot of evidence of animal cruelty. And it sort of recognizes another interesting point, which is how can you look at birds that are not being hung correctly on the slaughterhouse equipment, that are not being stunned appropriately, that are going through an automatic throat slit or getting cut in every place that they're hitting against that, flailing against the equipment, suffering? How can you look at the fact that hundreds plus birds are dying in short truck rides and not conclude that birds are suffering? I also thought it was interesting, at one point the district attorney talked about going to the No Kings anti-Trump protest, and the cognitive dissonance I thought was remarkable in that, in terms of how aggressively the state was going after activists, particularly with kind of a novel theory of prosecution, which effectively put someone's political beliefs on trial, because a vast majority of the state's case was going through kind of every witness's greatest hits of animal activism, whether it was relevant to what happened at the slaughterhouse or not, whether it was relevant to Purdue specifically or not. The state took great exception to the fact that activists were protesting Trader Joe's and Safeway, asking them to cut ties with Purdue, or that activists were engaging in constitutionally protected lawful protests outside of the homes of high up Petaluma poultry employees that specifically could stop these gross excesses of animal cruelty. After the trial, the elected district attorney, Carla Rodriguez, tried to chat with me, I think under a belief that we are some sort of legal colleagues and we would have kind of a nice conversation. That quite did not go the way I think she thought it would go, because I asked her repeatedly, how many times does someone have to report a crime before the district attorney, whose ethical obligation is to seek justice, does a goddamn thing about it? If I was assaulted, how many times do I have to call the DA to have anyone care? And she claimed, hey, I'll meet with activists anytime. That turned out to be a lie. Zoe tried to speak with Ms. Rodriguez, who literally ran away right after I was speaking to her in this photo, and has refused to speak to activists ever since, which is unsurprising because, again, it's very clear that the district attorney is biased against activists and towards industry. Another aspect I thought was remarkable was what was going on outside of the courtroom. There was a lot of significant press attention that focused not just on Zoe and her story, but the animals and what it means to put yourself on the line to prevent animals from suffering, and what happens to animals such as Ivy, Aster, Poppy, and Azalea. And I think that's really important because it starts creating a culture, or adding to the culture, in which places like Purdue should be feeling the pressure from not just the animal rights community, but society at large about how they treat animals. It creates a culture where people can feel protected in taking action for the animals. Because the state and Purdue wanted this case to be about scaring activists, not just from engaging in open rescues, but challenging industry as a whole. It wasn't limited to what Zoe just did. It was sought to prevent people from protesting outside of people's homes and asking district attorneys to prosecute animal cruelty. So I thought that was one significant aspect outside of this trial that will have a significant impact of the animals. And I think Zoe would agree that the price she is currently paying and the risk that she took and is taking being in jail is certainly worth it for this culture that is being added to, in addition to the value of Poppy, Ivy, Aster, and Azalea. I think the other remarkable thing is this has not deterred activists. Activists have been rescuing animals since Zoe was convicted all across the world, just showing that the activists will not be deterred in rescuing animals. For every day thus far of Zoe's sentence, there have been stories published by DXC of animal rights activists engaging in other rescues. There has been continued pressure against Trader Joe's to cut ties with Petaluma Poultry. So the state's goal in this case, which is to deter activism, has simply failed. So finally, before I open it up to questions, I think it's super important not just to support Zoe, but to support not just all political prisoners, but all prisoners. And there are a variety of ways in which you can support Zoe. And you can go to freezoe.org or dxc.io/jail support for a lot of this information. But there's a petition on freezoe.org asking for a pardon from the governor. There's been over 37,000 signatures to that petition. A representative from the governor's office has already called the Sonoma County Jail expressing concerns over Zoe's health. Because Zoe is a type 1 diabetic with a particularly complicated case of type 1 diabetes. That is a life-altering and life-threatening disability. Further complicating that, she has gastroparesis, which means her stomach is partially paralyzed. She left the hospital the day before trial with a feeding tube up her nose, and she remains having that while she's in jail. And the jail in Sonoma County is run by this terrible private company called WellPath, which has been sued thousands of times for inadequate medical care and medical neglect, particularly resulting in other type 1 diabetics dying or having significant medical issues. Zoe is also effectively in solitary confinement in violation of not only Sonoma County's own policy, but California regulations. Solitary confinement has often been discussed as cruel and unusual punishment. But those are the conditions Zoe is in, which pales in comparison to the conditions that the thousands of birds at the Petaluma Poultry Slaughterhouse live in when they're there. So in addition to signing the pardon petition, you can share Zoe's story at #FreeZoe and #RightToRescue. You can download an I Stand With Zoe social media graphic and post, raise awareness. You can write to Zoe in jail. And while Zoe should be getting released in about a week, she will still be able to access any letters that are sent to the jail that arrive after she's released. You can also go to the links on this slide to get more information, particularly pigeonly.com, which is one of those terrible companies that overcharge for basic services through private prisons. So you can go there and send Zoe a card or photos, things like that, which should be a little quicker at offensively high rates, but that's also an option. But I think the most important way you can support Zoe is to not stop fighting for the animals. In fact, to fight even harder for the animals and to not be deterred or scared based on what happened to Zoe. Because that's not what Zoe would want. And more importantly, that's not what the animals that suffer in places like the Petaluma Poultry Slaughterhouse want or need. And I think we have to keep fighting for the animals to essentially pursue this morally justified goal and to alleviate cruelty. So that being said, I will stop sharing and happy to answer any questions.
Questions. We are open for questions, and I appreciate that presentation. So, Chris, can you talk a little bit more about Purdue's Petaluma Poultry Factory Farms as a business entity? Anything else about how they operate? Do you think they'll make any changes? How do we know? And do you sort of think they're putting out propaganda, so to speak?
They're not going to make any changes because their whole business model is maximizing profits, and they give zero care to the welfare of the chickens and also public health. I mean, that's demonstrated by the fact that for years they have routine issues of salmonella rates. These are things that can be corrected. The federal government, through regulations, has corrective action plans, and Petaluma Poultry fails to do that. And that's a willing action. So they're going to treat the animals as poorly as they can get away with to maximize their profits. Now, has Purdue engaged in propaganda? 100%. They send out PR every time there's something in the news. They have filed what I think are frivolous and bogus lawsuits against activists who are doing home demonstrations, constitutionally protected lawful conduct, sending out PRs for that, putting on this narrative that, they're scaring the employees, many of which aren't even home during most of these. They put up numerous billboards with all this, we treat our animals right propaganda. Interestingly enough, with all this happy imagery of sunny factory farms and clip art or stock photos of birds, and not actually the reality of what the birds actually look like. Direct Action Everywhere did put up a billboard saying, when they say it's free range and organic, this is what they mean, showing the actual photos from inside. I believe it was McCoy's, which is another interesting thing that the state tried to enforce gag orders against Zoe numerous times, specifically related to these billboards, but did not really care when Purdue was putting up billboards of their own. Purdue also fought us in court, unfortunately successfully, in our attempts to get a lot of the records that were excluded, condemnation and things like that. So I think the point of the state's prosecution and Purdue's role in it was this whole case was a PR attempt.
Yeah, that sort of leads into my next question. I know Wayne Chung, as well as yourself, have, said that Zoe's prosecution is primarily a scare tactic. And that in the past that has worked. I think back in the early 2000s or whenever it was, where activists, the movement took their eye off the ball a little bit and let that scare them. And, can you say anything else about that, them using it to scare us? And in fact, it's boomeranging, and there's more rescues than ever. It's really shining a spotlight on animal exploitation.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to in the early aughts, the Green Scare, which is, essentially treating animal and environmental activists as, per the FBI, the number one domestic terror threat. And we see that with designer legislation, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. We see that with the federal government aggressively going after individuals who engage in property destruction, for the Earth, Earth Liberation Front, activists getting terrorist designations. You see that in the prosecution of the Shack 7, a group who essentially ran a website talking about all the things that activists were doing to stop Huntington Life Sciences from abusing animals. They were prosecuted under the predecessor of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and sentenced between 1 and 7 years in prison. One of those defendants was brought to a specialized federal prison called a Communications Management Unit, which is a highly restrictive facility that primarily holds violent terrorists, and you're effectively in solitary confinement. And unfortunately, that really did have a negative impact on animal rights activism that we now see really rebounding with groups like Animal Activism Collective and Direct Action Everywhere, and CAF, the Coalition to Abolish the Fur Trade. And then we have this resurgence in grassroots activism. And that's why our project really exists, is there was a huge problem during that time period of access to not just attorneys in general, well, to good attorneys, but attorneys in general. There were very few. Lauren Regan with the Civil Liberties Defense Center has been fighting for environmental and animal rights activists since that time period, doing great work, continuing to do great work. But as someone who has done activism myself, has been a defendant in a federal prosecution or a prosecution by the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., I know firsthand just how difficult it is to continue going without having an attorney have your back through an alienating legal system. But I think it's enlightening, or it's inspiring to see that this conduct is not being deterred by these prosecutions. And I think also it's important to look at the context of the early aughts, where, it was a post 9/11 world where we're talking about terrorism. But don't get me wrong. I mean, it's just that this administration, the Trump administration, is using the same Shack Green Scare playbook just against different organizations, Antifa, using evidence of anarchist literature as saying you're a member of a foreign terrorist or domestic terrorist organization. We see prosecutions such as Cop City and Prairie Land. These are not animal cases, but they are very much pulling from the Shack playbook. We see a Palestinian solidarity activist being treated the same way. So most certainly that same playbook very well could be used against animal rights activists again. And that's what's going to happen anytime a social movement is actually threatening power. And it's important just not to be deterred by that. And to sort of take Zoe's example, because Zoe most certainly, I don't think, is deterred. In fact, I think she's pretty emboldened.
Yeah.
And of course, just the caveat here, I am speaking my own personal opinions here, not necessarily Zoe's. It's worth noting that the state did try to introduce statements by someone on our legal team in which she was talking about, when you do an appeal in Wayne's case, you can actually win by losing, which means create good law. And they tried to actually introduce that during Zoe's trial unsuccessfully.
Yeah. Well, we have a bunch of questions coming in, but before that, I just wanted to ask you, you're talking about the events that were happening outside of the courtroom, even in terms of the right to rescue and asking Governor Newsom to pardon Zoe, and the celebrities like Joaquin and Moby coming out in her defense, and all the mainstream national media attention that this is getting. What, if any, effect is this having now, or will it have?
I think there are sort of two types of effect you can look at. One is going to be like actual material, tangible effects, which we necessarily haven't seen. I mean, I think one of the short-term material, tangible goals would be a place like Trader Joe's or Safeway cutting ties because with Purdue, because they're one of the biggest consumers of Petaluma Poultry's brand of Rocky and Rosie, which is this complete bullshit consumer ploy that these are like happy, healthy chickens. And I think, some of the things that we can see is additional energy going towards those campaigns. I think the second sort of impact is a little bit more abstract. And I was sort of mentioning that earlier, which is sort of creating this culture, not only of scrutiny upon places like Purdue and upon people's relationships with animals, but also generally being involved in activism and scrutiny over how the prosecution will do. I mean, they've spent over $100,000 in this case just in hours alone with multiple attorneys and investigators prosecuting this case on behalf of one of the richest animal agriculture poultry producers in the country.
So first question we have is, thank you for sharing this important info. How might mailing Zoe be used against us? I plan to write to her in any case.
Yeah, well, I mean, anything that you write, any statement you make can be used against you. So there are a litany of situations in which, if you write, I did this rescue, obviously that could be used against you. And, it's not particularly my role to tell you what to do, but you should be making knowing and intelligent decisions and know what the risks are. I think if you go to the Direct Action Everywhere support site for Zoe, it has a lot of tips about, things that would be helpful to talk about. And if you go to the Sonoma County Sheriff website that is on the slide, you can see a lot, they even have things that will say like, the person's not going to get the mail if you talk about X, Y, and Z, encouraging violence or things like that. But I think most importantly, when writing, prisoners, especially political prisoners, they just kind of want to not feel alone. And you can write just about like how inspired you are by their actions, or just here's a thing that I've been doing that I'm like really into. Like I've written to political prisoners about like, hey, there's this really interesting book I've been reading, because it's just about having that connection with the outside world and feeling supported. So your letters don't even have to be about activism.
Good advice there. Next question. How is Zoe now? Is she able to keep her medical equipment? I know you were touching, and there's been lots of concerns about her health. I know her parents are pretty upset. And did they testify at the sentencing? Is there anything you want to share or can share about that?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Zoe has, really serious health issues, complex type 1 diabetes and gastroparesis. And the Sonoma County Jail doesn't have the greatest reputation in providing medical care. And as I mentioned, the private provider WellPath has a terrible reputation. The Department of Justice at one point indicated that their conduct across the country could be tantamount to cruel and unusual punishment. So there were a lot of concerns that even the short time that Zoe will spend in jail could have really significant health issues, potentially even resulting in her death. And that's something that, we're still concerned about. Fortunately, she was able to keep her glucose monitor and insulin pump. When she was arrested, she was told by medical staff, like, you should bail out because we will probably take that from you. And she has been able to keep her feeding tube. I see another question. The jail has not been allowing Zoe to have as many glucose tabs as she would like, as she thinks she may need to monitor her type 1 diabetes. I think it's really important, for type 1 diabetics to have the medical autonomy to treat their own issues, particularly with, glucose issues can happen very quickly. The effects can happen very quickly. And immediate access to things like food and glucose tabs are consistent with the American Diabetes Association for how individuals incarcerated with type 1 should be treated. That being said, I mean, she is hanging in there now. It's hard to have, jail is shitty no matter what. And, particularly when you're effectively in solitary confinement. But again, Zoe doesn't want you to think about that. Zoe wants you to think about the thousands of birds that are suffering at places like the Petaluma slaughterhouse day in and day out.
Mm. Next question is, are these chickens only sold through Trader Joe's? I found their employees were not aware of any of this lawsuit. I wonder if they're kind of blocking it from them.
Purdue Farms sells to all sorts of grocery stores, specifically Petaluma Poultry's Rocky and Rosie brand. Trader Joe's is the main customer. So Trader Joe's is not the only customer. Certainly, a lot of Trader Joe's employees are familiar with the animal abuse by Petaluma Poultry because activists are making it known with protests at Trader Joe's store openings and things like that. Trader Joe's has, in fact, sued Direct Action Everywhere based on these protests. But unsurprisingly, Trader Joe's probably is not being super public about it, even though there has been support with Trader Joe's unions in solidarity with the request to cut ties with Petaluma Poultry, which is an important thing, which I would encourage sort of all activists, especially animal rights activists, to look at ways in which we can sort of build those bridges in solidarity with other movements, because I think that relationship will be pretty impactful.
Mm. Yes, I mean, our hearts are with Zoe, certainly. I'm putting myself in her place and just feeling lots of empathy for her, but just also so proud of her as well. Question here is, when Zoe is released, what's next? Do we know how she will spend the rest of her sentence? There's a process, right? There's a process, I think.
Yeah, so in addition to her jail sentence of 30 days, which again, with the day of credit and halftime is about 14 days, she has to serve 60 days under a jail alternative program, which is work release or in-home detention. And that would keep her out of jail, allow her to go to school, meet any necessary medical appointments and things like that. She is in the application process, but we're very confident that she will be approved for one of those programs, likely in-home detention. The jail was already aware of that possibility and was already telling us she's going to be a good candidate for that. So she will spend effectively 30 days of that 60-day sentence in one of those jail alternative programs, which will allow her to finish her final semester at UC Berkeley, which was something she had to put on pause for this semester due to the trial. And then she will have, 2 years from December 3rd of probation. And some of those probation conditions are involve her not having contact with other alleged co-conspirators, which include some activists with direct action everywhere, which makes organizing, associating for conduct that is lawful protest very difficult.
I think this question is in reference to Purdue's propaganda, their sort of false advertising, what they say, the misinformation. Can we not sue for misinformation or misleading the consumer with lies?
Yeah, so there are options in California to sue under consumer fraud. Groups like the Animal Legal Defense Fund and Legal Impact for Chickens, they have done a lot of general litigation for consumer fraud in California against other facilities. That's kind of in their wheelhouse to do that. So certainly those are potential avenues that can be pursued through the civil context.
Gotcha. So someone's also asking about the $100,000 fine. What about that? That Zoe has been told she has to pay. How does that work? How long does she have the rest of her life, I guess, to pay that? How does that, or is that going to change at all?
So it's not necessarily a fine, and it's not set in stone. So the $100,000 figure is restitution. Restitution is in any criminal case, which is to make the victim whole. So, for instance, I'm a victim of a crime. Someone rams my car. The defendant, if convicted of the crime, has to pay to make my car fixed. Sometimes that may mean replacing it. The same applies in Zoe's case. And Purdue is seeking essentially all the losses from the disruption of production on that day, which they claim is over $100,000. That's not set in stone. We are objecting to that restitution. Zoe is entitled to due process where we're permitted to challenge that. Generally, the court will determine whether or not those losses are approximately caused by Zoe's conduct. Ultimately, for restitution, Zoe would have to make reasonable efforts to pay that during the pendency of her probation if she's financially able to do so. And she doesn't have to pay that entire amount by probation. That often after a sentence, it becomes a civil judgment. And that is for the rest of her life, cannot be discharged during bankruptcy. And that applies to all criminal defendants. So that's restitution. The judge actually waived a vast majority of the fines and fees, keeping in mind that she may have that significant restitution amount.
Okay. I guess that's a little bit of good news, perhaps, in that. Question, has Zoe made any comments on the jail food? Does she have vegan options? And can we help with that?
She hasn't commented on the food. Zoe doesn't like to complain about things happening to her. She'd rather people focus on the much worse things happening to the animals. Petaluma Poultry does, not Petaluma Poultry, the Sonoma County Jail does have vegan options for inmates, and particularly vegan options for the specific formula she has to use through the feeding tube, which provides half the daily calories that she needs.
All right, we're open for more questions. Folks, you're welcome to continue to put your questions in the comment section. I'll relay them to Chris. We're here with Chris Carraway from AADLP. He is Zoe Rosenberg's lead counsel. Yeah, so, I even saw that activists are also being called extremist groups. That's the first time I sort of saw that. It's such a reflection, again, of the culture and the times that we're in. Do we need to be concerned? What do we need to know about that they're using these these terms are now being thrown around, and these things can stick. In addition to we're bioterrorists, as well.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what industry and the state did during the Green Scare. They labeled these activists, animal and environmental activists who in the United States have never hurt or a human or a non-human animal. They called them terrorists. We see that now with anti-fascist activist or pro-Palestinian activist. We represent a defendant in the Cop City case in Atlanta, Georgia, in which 61 activists are being charged under a RICO statute alleging, in part, domestic terrorism for a campaign to stop a militarized police training facility. Very much the Shack model. And some of the alleged overt acts in that RICO conspiracy involve a bail fund, engaging in a camping in the forest in which they wanted to, and unfortunately did, clear cut to build this facility, passing out flyers about a state trooper that murdered an activist, shot him, and shot them, in the forest. So we still see this rhetoric being weaponized and used. And the industry is most certainly trying to use this again for animal rights activists, calling them extremists, calling them terrorists. The state, again, the district attorney, Matt Hobson, was obsessed with trying to claim that Zoe and other activists caused the spread of avian flu in 2023, which is a complete unsupported nonsense claim. That is just a smear, ignoring the fact that these places have terrible biosecurity and all the other causes of avian flu, which is demonstrated by the fact that there was yet again another avian flu outbreak at some of these facilities in which there have been no investigations or entries by animal rights activists. So there's certainly an attempt to label these folks as extremists and terrorists in order to sort of invoke more heavy-handed prosecution or demonizing these activists. I think that's especially concerning with the Trump administration and how many resources they likely are going to be putting together or devoting to just stamping out progressive or social causes. And again, we see this in the anti-fascist context. You look at Prairie Land or the recent arrest of the Turtle Liberation Front or Turtle Liberation Army. These really serious charges, which are designed to demonize activists as terrorists, of course, while ignoring right-wing terrorism that is actually killing people.
So I think, am I correct that part of her sentencing was that she's not allowed to be in contact with certain people? Can you talk a bit about that? And what exactly are they afraid of with that?
Well, so she's not allowed to be in contact with any alleged co-conspirators, people that were discussed during trial, witnesses at trial, which is not an uncommon condition in conspiracy cases. I mean, you'll see even further where California courts will impose conditions prohibiting a defendant from having contact with a certain gang, which, police manufacture people's ties to gangs or specific gangs in such a broad view that effectively encapsulates an entire community or neighborhood. So those things, unfortunately, aren't that uncommon. But the practical reality is, there's about half a dozen people that Zoe cannot have contact with. And that makes sort of organizing through direct action everywhere just logistically difficult.
And does that have an endpoint on it where at some point that will end and she will be able to be freely in contact with them?
Yeah, it's the end of her probation. Wayne had similar, but frankly, much more restrictive conditions just because the alleged co-conspirators in Wayne's case from two separate incidents involved a lot more individuals. And, when Wayne's probation finished, he was allowed to have contact with all those other folks, which included Zoe.
Right. Another question is regarding the pamphlet sent to all the homes in Sonoma County prior to the trial, which said, "Stand with local farmers." Can that be viewed as jury tampering? And if so, will the appeal include that?
I mean, I think that most definitely is jury tampering. I have some pretty good educated guesses, in the County Farm Bureau about who sent that out. That being said, that's not going to be an issue that we can raise in during appeal. We were, allowed to talk to jurors about things of that nature. That is kind of third party conduct. Now, if it were the state making these statements or sending those out, that would be a much different question. But that's not necessarily going to be a thing that can be raised on appeal. Oftentimes appeals are really limited to legal issues that were raised before the judge that the judge simply got wrong. And those errors caused the impact to trial, to the defendant's outcome in trial.
Mm. Okay, yeah, good. We're still open for more questions, and we definitely want to not forget to talk about AADLP and what you're all about there. It sort of relates. I was just going to ask you, I'm just wondering how our Poppy, Ivy, Esther, and Azalea, and who's watching her sanctuary. I believe that her mother is also co-founder of her sanctuary. Is that right? And somebody's asking also, didn't Zoe's mother testify at trial? Does that mean Zoe can't communicate with her mother?
A couple questions. So Poppy, Ivy, Esther, and Azalea are thriving at a sanctuary. They're doing great. Zoe's mother and volunteers are watching Happy Hen, which is a couple hours from Berkeley. Zoe's obviously a college student, so hasn't been down there day to day. So it's really fallen on Zoe's mother. Happy Hen is supported by donations. So I would encourage folks to look at ways of supporting either Happy Hen or their local animal rescue or sanctuary through volunteer time. Zoe's mom ultimately did not end up testifying at trial, but the court's order wasn't excluding anyone that testified at trial. It was excluding any alleged co-conspirators.
Okay, that's good. Would that be torture? You can't speak to your own mother. That's not. There's some humanity there. In that, you don't know the website for Happy Hen Sanctuary, or people can just Google that. Maybe we can find that and put it. I didn't mean to make you work. Put that in the section, because we do love people to donate. That's one way to support the animals.
No, happyhen.org.
It is happyhen.org. How simple.
Yeah.
How simple. That would have been my guess. Happyhen.org. Okay, cool. Let's see. Let's take another question. But with it, we definitely want to talk about AADLP. And did Trader Joe's lawyer issue an injunction against activists in all cities? The police halted our in-store disruption quite quickly in New York City.
So Trader Joe's did sue Direct Action Everywhere, seeking an injunction. And I believe that case did resolve with a settlement. I don't actually know the specifics because we weren't the attorneys in that civil case. So ultimately, I'm not entirely certain about how that would have an impact if it's a non-DXE protest. I mean, only DXE was sued. So that civil stuff should not have impact. Of course, in-store disruptions are a little different, from protests outside, because private residences or businesses, you can be told to leave. And if you don't leave, you can be forced to leave. Physical force can be used against you to leave, reasonable physical force. You can be charged with trespass if you refuse to leave. And in a vast majority, with some very unique, nuanced aspects, you can be sued for trespass. So in-store disruptions are just a separate context in terms of, like, generally, you can be forced to leave by the private party or by law enforcement. It's a much different circumstance when you're on public property like the sidewalk, these protected areas of expression for speech.
Yeah, I want to remind people that you covered so much of what we're talking about, a little bit about here, in your Know Your Rights activist training that you did for AAC last year, or I think it was early last year. So maybe we can put, again, link to that, but it's right here on our YouTube channel. So I was watching it again today. I definitely encourage folks to go back. You cover so much of the basics and specifics about knowing your rights, what to look for, what to watch out for, dealing with police, the whole thing in that training, which was really, really excellent and tailored for activists. So, thank you again, reminding people about that. But let's talk. We're still open for questions, but let's talk about AALDP. I think I was saying DLP. I trip over my tongue, but I said this last time. I love your mission, which is keeping animals and activists out of cages. Right. I don't know if that's your, that's your tagline. I love it. I love it. So expand on AALDP's mission and purpose and approach.
Yeah. First of all, we're good lawyers. We're not good at naming organizations, apparently. It's a mouthful. The Animal Activist Legal Defense Project at the University of Denver Stern College of Law is a lot to say, I understand. But, really where the Animal Activist Legal Defense Project came from is this fundamental belief that social change comes from the bottom up. It's not going to be some politician. It's not going to be some judge. It's certainly not going to be some company that's going to decide we're going to do the right thing on their own. It's not going to be some asshole attorney that comes up with a creative legal argument that creates social change. No, it's going to be the activists on the ground. Take, for example, gay marriage and that Supreme Court case. Those identical arguments likely would have failed 10 to 15 years prior. And that's because the reason it won when it won is the activist on the ground. Oftentimes, when you are engaging in activism, when you are challenging systems or people's profits, that invites conflict, which often plays out in a courtroom, which is designed to be alienating to everyday folks, to discourage people. And as I mentioned, there's often a access to attorney gap for activists, especially because attorneys can cost a lot of money. And it can divert activist resources, money, time, energy, emotional energy in these cases. So our job is to provide that support so activists can keep focusing on the effective work that they're doing, and let us try to take the load of dealing with the legal case as much as we can. And that's really where we were kind of born out of. And that's what we've endeavored to do during the 3 years that we've been operating. We've represented activists in over 50 cases all across the country: California, Oregon, Michigan, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Florida, Arkansas, Illinois, North Carolina, Wisconsin. We have generally resulted in acquittals, a right to rescue case in Merced, California, with Foster Farms, an AAC case in Portland, Oregon, involving a Hannah Anderson store disruption, cases in Arkansas, things like that. We have defeated attempts to get restraining orders against activists for protesting foie gras in Washington, D.C. We have gotten numerous cases dismissed. We are in the process of shutting down Ridgeland Farms, a horrific beagle breeding and research facility in Wisconsin. And that's sort of the work we're doing. But most importantly, we're not actually doing that work. Activists are doing that work, and we're supporting them. And we're also a law school class. We're a law school classes. So, throughout the year, we'll have anywhere between 8 to 12 students who are actively working with us on the cases, coming out to the trials. And, we're showing law students that you can actually do legal work on behalf of activists, on behalf of movements. Because a lot of law students, they go to law school hoping to do a lot of good with their law degree. And law school kind of discourages that. So not only are we showing them, yeah, you can do that, but here's sort of the path, and here's how it works in certain context.
Yeah, it's your chosen path for sure.
Also, I want to note for the question about the in-store disruption being stopped by the police, go to aaldp.com. Shoot us an email. We want to help activists wherever you are, in whatever situation, in any way that we are able to.
Yeah. So you will answer if people come with just general advice kinds of questions, even though you say, I'm not your lawyer right now. We are not contracted I'm not your lawyer, but you'll still give some guidance and answers and all of that.
There are certain limitations. We can't give legal advice in states that we are not barred in. But certainly, we, as we've done in countless other cases, can get involved, can get permission to appear in other states, can connect activists with resources, and provide as much help as we can.
So then how do you decide which cases to take or not to take? I know every case is different. What's the screening? If someone right now believes they have a case, they want to reach out to you, what's first steps? What can they expect?
Well, we try to take as many cases as we possibly can. We are a small organization currently with two attorneys. But we still try to take as many cases that we possibly can. So each case is going to be different. Sometimes civil cases are different. Sometimes there are fast-moving criminal cases. So it just depends. But it all starts with an email.
Starts with an email. And you represent activists, whistleblowers, and investigators, although whistleblowers and investigators are also activists, obviously. So do you have like an equal amount in all three of those sort of categories, or more in one or the other?
It depends. I would say that most of our caseload has generally been criminal cases, although we have represented whistleblowers, someone who blew the whistle on Sequest, which is this like terrible strip mall aquarium. We've represented an activist who is being sued, or still actually being sued, for publishing drone footage over the Miami Seaquarium. They're now in bankruptcy proceedings, so his case is kind of just on pause as the bankrupt proceedings go. But what's interesting about that case is our client, Phil Demers, was really the only activist that has been suffering consequences as a result of the activism against the Seaquarium. And his drone footage, or the drone footage that has been sent to him that he published, was really instrumental in ultimately the county seeking to revoke the Seaquarium's lease and a lot of their financial problems, and instrumental with shutting down that facility. We've represented 3 women, former employees of Triple D Game Farm in Montana, which is this awful roadside zoo, who blew the whistle to the USDA and Rolling Stone about all the terrible things that happened there. So we do on occasion represent activists in whistleblowing cases, media cases, and civil cases, like restraining order cases, what we call SLAP cases, strategic lawsuits against public participation, which in short means we're going to bury you in this scary, expensive litigation to shut you up. And a lot of states have statutes that say you can countersue and collect fees and early dismissal if it's a lawsuit that's frivolous against constitutionally protected activity.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, we had one of those Sequest. We still have one of the Sequest aquarium locations here in New Jersey, where I am, and we've been part of that campaign. It's ongoing. We're still out there. What was I going to ask you? Oh, do you recommend that folks call you before they blow the whistle, or investigate or document or open rescue, or certainly right after, or only if you get caught, or what do you recommend?
People can reach out to us whenever. There are ethical limitations on what we can say to a potential client or anyone in general. So it always depends. We try to help as much as we can and answer as many questions as we can within our ethical obligations. So folks can reach out to us at any time. We've helped investigators release footage, keeping them confidential, and seeking enforcement actions. So again, each situation is going to be different. So we always encourage people to email, ideally not call, but email us as soon as they feel comfortable doing so. We're here to help.
Nice. What about attorneys who want to volunteer, who are hearing this now, and if they're interested in working with you, AALDP, as a volunteer attorney, what do they need to know and do? I think there's a volunteer attorney sign up sheet. Is that on the website, I guess?
Yeah, so if you go to aaldp.com, there is a volunteer attorney sign-up sheet. We always would love to either collaborate or partner with other attorneys as equal partners on a case. A lot of the times we do need local attorneys. We're not barred in every state, which means that in order for us to practice in a state that we are not barred in, admitted to the legal bar in that state, we have to do a process called pro hoc vice, and we need a local attorney to effectively be our sponsor. So we're often looking for that, particularly attorneys that are in kind of these rural areas, like New York City, Los Angeles, much easy to find movement aligned animal attorneys. Rural Idaho, upstate New York, sometimes a little bit more difficult. So we do encourage, other attorneys to reach out to us, fill out that form. We'd love to work with you.
Nice. All right. We're going to wrap up in a little while, but we'll take a couple more questions. And there's one here. Are there any other law organizations that do the same things that AALDP does?
Yeah. So I already shouted out the Civil Liberties Defense Center. They have been doing this work for a very long time. They were CLDC and Lauren Regan were attorneys and groups that I looked up to and still look up to, even before I went to law school. There are other groups, the National Lawyers Guild, that have been there for activists for decades. They're, private practitioners. Matthew Strugar in Los Angeles has done a lot of stuff with anti-SLAPP. Other organizations, Animal Partisan, Will Lowry, who has done a lot of Freedom of Information Act work and things like that. So there is a growing community that have been there to support activists. Attorney Bonnie Clapper has been really helpful to activists, particularly in New York. And a lot of those people certainly deserve their flowers. We are not the only group doing this really important work.
Yeah, and if folks are more familiar even than that of groups and organizations that provide this type of services, please put those in the comments section as well. And I know that, Chris, part of the purpose of AALDP as well is to advance the welfare and understanding of animal suffering. So animals are front and center for you. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of our work, is to elevate the stories and the rights of animals through our representation of activists. It's our ethical obligation, is what we want to do, which is to pursue what our clients want us to do. And every client that we've had wants us to focus on the stories and the suffering of the animals. And it's, and that's why, we focus so much, on the legal litigation, pursuing that, animals deserve the protections of personhood, like in the necessity defense. Animals are worthy of someone invoking that defense because they have rights. Animals fall under the definition of person, which is what we see in a lot of these necessity statutes. It's about elevating not just the stories of our clients, but of the animals that they are advocating on their behalf. So that's, very important to us.
Does AALDP have someone barred in Illinois?
None of the staff attorneys do, but we do have partners that we are currently representing an activist in Ogle County, Illinois, with a group showing animals respect and kindness of an activist who was reporting animal cruelty at a rodeo, is being prosecuted by the state's attorney there in Ogle County. We set that case for trial in February. We were working with Brad Thompson, an attorney with the People's Law Office in Chicago. So that's a great example of collaborating with other really righteous, great movement attorneys. The People's Law Office is a great organization that defends activists. Brad's representing another defendant in Cop City. So that's an example where we'll partner with an attorney as our local sponsor, so we can go into states that we're not formally barred in.
Okay. In California, does the 60 days not get half, or the 90 days gets half for good behavior? Is that what that's about?
Yeah, it gets halved. You get day for day credit. So, her in jail sentence would be 15 days minus 1 for credit she had when she was arrested for 1 day. And then the 60 days under jail alternatives is halved. So that would be 30 days.
Do you think, another question, that judge felt pressure to give jail time? He didn't seem to like what he really wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think judges feel pressure one way or the other. If this were any other case, absolutely, there'd be no jail time. I've most definitely represented, as a public defender for a decade, I've most definitely represented defendants who have ultimately been convicted or pled guilty to much, violent conduct, things like that, who have had probation with no jail. I think the fact that this is a case that really had a lot of attention on both sides had an impact on both directions for the judge. So, I think I could see some struggle with what to do in this case throughout the entire case, because a lot of the questions we're throwing at the judge, legal questions, were kind of issues of first impression, where you can't look to a court case and that's the answer. So I think certainly there was pressure. The 2 years of probation, just looking at the questions in the chat, that doesn't get halved.
Okay, so definitely 2 years in that way. Yeah, my thoughts are, I don't know how people sleep at night. That's kind of my thoughts as well, like the prosecution. So, okay. I mean, Chris, because we're kind of nearing the end. I don't know that we have any other questions, but is there anything we missed then? Any final words? Anything we missed? Anything else you want to summarize? Do you want to repeat any of the calls for action and leave us on a hopeful note as well?
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to kind of lightning round some of the questions that are still in there. So you can write Zoe from the United Kingdom. And someone asked a question about the gas mask behind me. We live in dangerous times. If you've been unfortunate to be in a situation where there has been gas at a protest, it sucks. So it's always helpful to be prepared. Mirror Safety is one company that you can get a decent, somewhat affordable gas mask. And parting thoughts, it just goes back to support, Zoe. Go to freezoe.org. Support all political prisoners. They are doing time for doing the work on behalf of something greater than themselves. But beyond that, support prisoners in general. Oftentimes you'll see folks in jail. The criminal justice system goes after, poor, primarily people of color, and those folks deserve dignity. And I think you can really be a lifeline to writing prisoners in general in challenging a lot of these systems. But I think the most important thing that you can do is continue to fight and advocate for the animals. And that's the thing that Zoe would want you to do. That's the thing that every single animal that is at places like Petaluma Poultry would want you to do.
Absolutely. So let us continue to do that, to be unified, to stand in solidarity with Zoe. It certainly does seem like a historical moment in so many ways, but thank you for your good work, Chris. We really appreciate it. I know folks can give props to Chris and ALLDP in the comment section as well, but thank you so much. So
yeah, thanks for having me and all the work that AAC does.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, to become a patron for as little as $2 a month, please find AAC on Patreon so we can continue to provide free educational resources. If you're interested in becoming a mentor or a mentee or want to get involved, please visit our website, Please hit subscribe here on our channel, smash that bell, and give us a like. Please follow us on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And, I opened with Zoe's words, so I will close with Zoe's words. It's all been worth it to give even one or two animals a chance to experience freedom and care for the first time in their entire lives. Someday, soon, every animal will be safe, happy, and free. So that's who it's for. So, all right, folks, until next time, AAC signing off.